I didn't hear him until I turned off the news. I'd seen the name of my school scroll across the bottom in the list of local closures due to snowfall, and so had no reason to keep it on. The second the anchor's boring drawl was silenced, I heard the deep guttural growl coming from the kitchen. It startled me, and the hair on my arm stood up, but quickly I realized it was just my dog. "Axel, what's wrong?" I asked as I stood and made my way out to the living room and into the kitchen. The 2-year-old Rottweiler had his teeth bared, tail wagging sharply to the left as he growled at the door to the basement. I felt my gut twist as I wondered what could possibly be bothering him. Axel didn't even bark at the mailman. "Boy, what is it?" Axel didn't even acknowledge me. He just kept his eyes set on the basement door and maintained his low, threatening, rumbling growl. "Axel, is there someone in the basement? Axel, Axel," I shouted, but still he didn't react. The twisting in my gut slowly turned into frustration. I walked to the back of the kitchen and opened the door to the garage with a huff. Probably a stupid chipmunk or raccoon or something. I muttered as I clambered over some junk to get to the shelf with the sports equipment. Just as I wrapped my fingers around the grip of a baseball bat, I heard a sharp yelp, and Axel's growling stopped abruptly. My whole body tensed and I scrambled back through the maze of clutter. "Axel?" I cried, worried something had hurt him. I leapt through the doorway back into the kitchen and found myself facing the basement door. It was open. I stared at the dark threshold for a few moments, just flabbergasted and confused, and then a quiet whimper drew my attention. Axel was cowering under the kitchen table, tail between his legs. I barely felt relief wash over me. I was glad he was okay, but I had no idea what could have opened the basement door, or if what was down there was up here now. My eyes shifted around the room, looking for anything else out of place, or any sign that something had passed through. Most likely emboldened by my presence, Axel crawled out from under the table and resumed growling, baring his teeth towards the basement again. Judging by that, I guess whatever was down there was still down there. "What is it, boy?" I asked quietly, nervously, knowing I wouldn't get an answer from the dog, and slowly I approached the opening. One hand reluctantly leaves the baseball bat to reach for the light switch. Axel advanced slowly with me, staying next to my feet, but I could tell his growl didn't carry the same threat it had earlier. Something had really terrified him. I gulped as my fingers reached the switch, and I set my eyes on the darkness. I exhaled and flipped the switch. The light flickered for a moment, just long enough to reveal a big hole in the floor of the basement that looked like something the size of a bear had dug its way out. And then the bulb shattered, and the basement was drenched in darkness again. Axel's growling became more intense and strained. He barked twice. My heart pounded in my chest, and my knuckles turned white as my grip tightened on the baseball bat. My free hand lowered to my pocket and slowly pulled out my phone, shakily navigating to the flashlight app. "What the hell?" I whispered harshly to myself, and my thumb tapped the flashlight icon. The bright white light illuminated the basement. The gap in the floor looked about 8 to 10 feet deep from where I was standing, though I could see that a passageway in the hole led deeper, and it was about 5 feet across. The edges were jagged and crumbling, but I noticed that there was no debris on the floor around it, and so the idea that some animal had crawled up through seemed unlikely. Still perturbed but feeling a little safer, I began descending the steps to get a better look. But I only made it a couple steps before Axel started going out of his mind, barking loudly and aggressively, startling me. "Axel!" I called as I turned to shout at him. "It's okay. It's just a hole. The floor collapsed or something. Relax." But Axel just kept at it. I turned back around and continued descending, hoping that once I made it down there, he would see nothing was wrong and calm down. 2 small, red dots were floating in the air above the hole, like little eyes peering at me. I blinked a few times, trying to make sense of the image, wondering if I was seeing things, but then they moved slightly, sliding an inch or so to the left, and as they did, an outline shimmered around them, almost looking like a head. I was holding my breath, and my heart had resumed pounding in my chest like a war drum, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. fear and confusion gripped me like a vice, and the longer I stared at the two red dots, the more of an outline visibly shimmered around it. Ears, a nose, maybe, or a snout, a mouth, teeth. It seemed like the light from my phone was getting in the way, making the presence harder to see. Without thinking, my thumb tapped my phone, extinguishing the light. Its red eyes casted a glow over the rest of its gray body, the mangy, rodent-like head slowly leaning closer to me, guided by its long neck. Its snout twitched, and its mouth spread in a toothy grin as its jaw opened invitingly, and inside its mouth was another pair of small red eyes. I found myself too busy staring into its maw to look over the rest of the creature, or to move, or to do anything at all. I just stared, and wondered how I might taste. A particularly sharp bark from Axel seemed to snap me out of a trance. I gasped for breath, and then I screamed at the top of my lungs and re-engaged my phone light. The creature reeled back from the light and hissed, then quickly scurried down into the hole. Reading that as a sign of weakness, Axel darted for it, scrambling down the stairs after it, bumping into me in the process. I lost my balance and toppled forwards. Instinctively, I covered my head and tucked my chin, pulling my arms and legs close to my body as I tumbled, landing hard on the basement floor just in front of the hole, the baseball bat clattering down next to me. Everything ached, but I managed to look up just in time to see Axel give chase after the creature into the hole. "Axel, don't!" I called, but a blinding headache flared up at the exertion it took to yell. I groaned and rolled onto my back, only to see another pair of red eyes looking down at me. It was bathed in the light from my phone, and so was translucent like the other one had been at first. It seemed to regard me with amusement, images of a grinning mouth temporarily visible as the outline shimmered, and then it stepped away, moving towards the stairs. Even though I couldn't really see it, I heard its footsteps clop heavily up the wooden stairs and all the way into the kitchen. Then the door to the basement shut. My heart pounded, my head pounded, and I was gasping for breath like I'd just run a marathon. Questions and fear running rampant in my mind. I tried to wake up. It must have been a nightmare. I tried slapping myself and tears began to spill from my eyes when it didn't work. I curled my body up tighter and just shook for a few moments. Then I heard Axel bark again. He sounded far away. I sat up and looked at the hole, seeming to me like a gate to hell itself. My dog was down there. I pushed myself to my feet and cupped my hands around my mouth. "Axel, come back. Axel," I screamed. I waited a few seconds and then grit my teeth. I picked up my phone and started hastily looking around the basement for a more traditional flashlight. The phone wouldn't last long. I ended up doing one better for myself and found an old headlamp among some camping gear. With that donned and clicked on, I snatched the baseball bat and then posted up at the edge of the hole. I glanced over my shoulder once, up at the door to the kitchen. One of the creatures was up there in my house. I couldn't go that way anyway. I left my dad a cryptic sounding message that I knew he wouldn't take seriously. Sent him a picture of the hole to hopefully give my story some credibility, and then lowered myself down. I had to find Axel. I was about 9 years old when my family moved to Tacoma, Washington. My mom was going through a divorce with my dad, and we needed a place to stay since she couldn't afford her house. Consequently, she found a very cheap place in Tacoma for me, 9 years old, my brother, 1 year old, my sister, 7 years old, and herself to stay in. For those of you who are not familiar with Tacoma, it's a very poor blue-collar town with high crime, or at least it was when I was a kid. Many of the houses there are farm-style homes that are packed closely together in blocks. My friend once described Tacoma perfectly. He said it was Seattle's older brother who dropped out of high school to sell weed. Man, is that true. When we first got to our house, the first thing I noticed was how old it was. It was built in the 1930s, and much of the outside facade was falling apart on both floors. The windows were stained with dirt, but you could still see inside. The paint on the railing of the front porch was chipped and faded. When we opened the door, my mom had to use her shoulder to pop it open to get in. As we entered the living room, it was cold, very cold. It made me feel uneasy, but my mom told us that it was because it was an old house, so it was hard to keep the heat in. After exploring the first floor, I walked up the stairs to my new room, which my mom said was on the right. As I walked up the stairs, the floor creaked and cracked. I felt as though I would fall straight through the stairs and into the abyss below. When I opened my door, I was first delighted as to how big it was, much bigger than my sister's. But as I walked into it, I felt uneasy and goosebumps rose on my skin. I didn't know why, but when I turned to the corner of my room, I saw a door that made me feel scared. It was about 3/4 smaller than a normal door, so not the little doors you see in scary movies, but smaller than a normal one. Thought to myself, this must be the closet. But then why would my room have 2 closets? The first closet was on the other side of the door. Curiosity got a hold of me and I opened the little door. It wasn't until years later I learned that what I opened was a devil's door. The room's ceiling inside was slanted to the left. The room was about 6 feet tall until the ceiling slanted into the floor. You could only move a foot forward when entering the room before you were forced left until the room ended, which was about 3 feet long. I saw the exposed insulation of the house and wooden beams there with an unfinished wood floor. It smelled like cigarettes there too, and it felt emotionally heavy. The longer I stayed in that room, the more scared I got, so I left. After we finished packing, I was playing in my room with my cat and toys when I caught myself staring at the devil's door. It made me scared, but I have always been scared as a kid. I was bullied throughout elementary for being a sissy. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. So, I picked up my cat and a few G.I. Joe action figures and went through the devil's door to play. As soon as I put my cat down, he sprinted out of the room. He jumped on my bed and started to meow at me. At first, I felt uncomfortable, but as time went on, I felt a bit better. After 5 minutes of playing, I got out and closed the door, leaving my toys there. That's when things got weird. The next day, as I went to retrieve my toys from the floor in Devil's Door room, they weren't there. I looked around and I saw all 3 lined up perfectly on a piece of exposed wood near the ceiling of the room. I stared at them for some time before grabbing them. A few days later, the cats stopped using the stairs. They completely stopped using the stairs. If they were on the second floor, they stayed there, and if they were on the first floor, they stayed there. They never went between both floors and would cry at us if we picked them up and walked down the steps. It would get so bad that they would scratch us to get us to let go so they could run away. Within 2 weeks of living there, we would find cabinet doors in the kitchen wide open. Not all of them, but 2 or 3 at a time would be. Well, as this was happening, we constantly felt watched and unwelcomed. Anytime I used the kitchen cabinets, I felt watched and it felt angry. So much so that I would close the cabinets and leave without getting what I needed. As I played more in the Devil's Door room, things started to get worse with time. My sister's hamster, who was always so kind, attacked her friend pretty violently. Her friend screamed in pain as my sister had to pry her hamster off of her hand. Blood was rushing as she cried in pain. My mom drove her home and kept apologizing about it. It was so bad that she had to get stitches. At night, as I would lay in bed to sleep, I would hear things moving in behind the Devil's Door. It sounded like someone was shifting things around and walking about. As I would hold my cat tighter and stare at the door, there would be a heavy pound on the Devil's Door that I could see the Devil's Door move. I would rush under the sheets and cry with my cat, praying to God to protect us. When I would fall asleep, I had a recurring nightmare of sleeping in bed, only to be awakened by a man grabbing my neck with both of his hands. He would push down on me, and I would fall into my bed, further and further. At the beginning of the 4th week, I stopped playing in the room the Devil's Door opened to, but I had already set loose whatever was there. After nearly a month of living there, my mom was able to find a place near my grandparents to move into. She was able to get the house and we began packing immediately. A few days before we could move in, my sister and I were in the living room on the first floor. My mom walked from the dining room, where my brother was eating, to check on us. After a few minutes of talking, she went back into the dining room to see that my brother was gone. She looked in the kitchen and he wasn't there. She started to panic and my sister and I started to look immediately too. We looked everywhere on the first floor when we heard a loud crash upstairs. We sprinted upstairs to the bedroom where my brother was. He was crying on the floor with glass all around him. The glass shower door fell on his head and shattered into a million pieces. There was some blood on his head from the cuts too. My mom took him immediately to the hospital and, by the grace of God, he was for the most part okay. A few days later, we officially moved out of the house. I was so happy to be leaving it and relieved that I would be near my grandparents. We were in the car as my mom was just about to leave when I saw a light turn on in my room. My blood went cold as I saw the devil door open. I saw a man walk from the devil's door, walked in front of the window, and stared at us. I could only see his silhouette, but he had a long overcoat on and a hat on from the 40s. Smoke was dancing from where his mouth would be. Then I saw other shadows run past the light in my room. I assume it must be more spirits that occupy the house. I felt so angry, like it wanted to lash out at me for living there and to hurt me. Then my mom drove off, and we left. To whomever is reading this, if you find a small door, never open it. If you do and you see it goes nowhere, doesn't have a seeming purpose, leave immediately. That's a devil door, and it will bring any spirit that is there into the home. Devil doors are used as a gateway between the physical and spiritual world. When you open the door, you are inviting them into your house. Many people who do this get scared permanently and change for the worse, depressed, become abusive, etc. I was very lucky that didn't happen to me. But please, be safe out there.